Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the INVENT-VTE Network Global Thrombosis Research Seminar Series. Today, we're going to be hearing the RENOVE trial, methodology, study design, and impact on interpreting results of non-inferiority versus superiority trials. I'm Lisa Baumann-Kreitziger, the current chair of INVENT. So just as a reminder, INVENT is a partnership of 11 national VTE thrombosis research networks, and it supports and promotes international collaboration between the networks to produce relevant, high-quality academic VTE research. A special thank you to all of our funding partners over the years, including ISTH, Bristol Myers Squibb, Pfizer, Leo Pharma, Sanofi, and Boston Scientific. We can't do this work without them. So the seminar series in 2025 will consist of 3 seminars showcasing the results of practice-changing INVENT-endorsed studies. As a reminder, our seminars are recorded and they are available online at our website. So today, again, we will have talk about the RENOVE trial. In June, we will be discussing the pilot partum trial with Leslie Skeeth, and then we will have another seminar in September. And so please watch for announcements of those seminars as well. On to today's presentation. So we have 2 wonderful speakers today. And Francis Couturaud is currently the clinical professor of respiratory medicine at Brest University and is the head of the Department of Respiratory Medicine as well. So he is the director of the research unit GETBO EA 3878, which is dedicated to clinical research and basic science in venous thromboembolism. He's a member of the INVENT Investigation Network on Venous Thromboembolism, or RENOVE-VTE, and which promotes translational clinical research and European clinical studies on VTE. Dr. Couturaud is involved in clinical research on the diagnosis, epidemiology, and treatment of pulmonary embolism. He's been involved in many practice-changing studies on pulmonary embolism that have been published in major journals. Some of the notable studies include the PATUS-PE, PATUS-DVT, PITHO, and PREEPEC studies, and of course, the RENOVE trial that we're going to hear about today. So the optimal duration of anticoagulation in patients with VTE, particularly in cases of unprovoked venous thromboembolism, is one of his main fields of interest. And we're going to hear today about the practice-changing study that was just published. Émilie Presles is a statistician with a research unit of the University of Hospital of Saint Etienne, and that's led by Professor Sylvie Laporte with experience in clinical trial methodology combined with expertise as a biostatistician. She's contributed to the analysis of multiple projects on VTE, including many of the other trials that I just mentioned. So she's going to walk us through the statistical components and interest of this trial. So without further ado, I will let them take over. Please, as a reminder to the audience, submit your questions in the Q&A, and we'll have a Q&A session after our speakers are complete. Thank you very much.
Okay. Do you see my slides?
Hello.
Okay. Thank you very much for this introduction, and I would like to thank the INVENT-VTE network. It's a major network now on the world, and I'm very proud on behalf of all my colleagues from the RENOVE trial to present the results of these studies. So here are my disclosures. And so the study has been published in the Lancet on the 1st March. And this is about the optimal dose of extended treatment with anticoagulant on venous thromboembolism. Just a small word, the study is an academic study which was granted by the French Ministry of Health. sponsored by Brest University Hospital regarding administrative process. It was coordinated by the INVENT-VTE network, and methodology was done by, and all statistical analysis was done by Émilie Presles in Etienne Hospital. So the rationale is that in patients with venous thromboembolism at high risk of recurrence, for whom extended treatment with direct oral anticoagulants has been indicated, the optimal dose is still unknown. In fact, if we stop treatment in patients at high risk of recurrence, the risk of fatal recurrent venous thromboembolism will be elevated over the time. And regarding patients with pulmonary embolism, this risk is particularly high and will be higher than the risk of death by major bleeding while maintaining anticoagulant therapy. But this risk will catch up over the time, and it is even more visible in patients with deep vein thrombosis. And so the question is, could we decrease the risk of bleeding without loss in efficacy? And two studies have previously evaluated this issue, but not directly. In the Amplify extension trial, in patients where physicians were uncertain for continuing anticoagulant, extended 1 year full dose apixaban or dose apixaban were compared to placebo. And the study was powered for this comparison, but the study was not powered to confirm if low dose apixaban was as effective as and safer than full dose apixaban. The results are very interesting. First, it seems that full dose and low dose apixaban were equally effective. And there was also a few number of hemorrhage, but the study was not powered to confirm non-inferiority regarding efficacy of low dose. And moreover, there was no power enough to confirm superiority on the risk of bleeding. And in fact, there was no difference between the 3 study arms. Similarly, the Einstein choice is interesting because here extended full dose rivaroxaban and low dose rivaroxaban were compared to aspirin as a control group. Again, it was powered for this comparison, and the study was not powered to confirm if low dose rivaroxaban was as effective as and safer than full dose. The results are important because we can see that rivaroxaban 20 or 10 are more effective than aspirin. But again, here there was no power enough to confirm non-inferiority on efficacy and superiority on major and clinically relevant non-major bleedings. And so consensus guidelines are not very strong regarding the possibility to decrease the dose. Some guidelines suggest or recommend to consider the use of a reduced dose. Others suggest the use of a full dose or low dose. And consequently, robust evidence for recommending reduce over full dose drug therapy in patients in whom extended treatment has been indicated is lacking. It is why we performed the RENOVE trial, which was performed in patients where physicians were convinced and certain for continuing anticoagulation. So this is a patient with a high risk of recurrence, and the study was powered to demonstrate hierarchically non-inferiority on efficacy, and if so, on superiority and on safety and net clinical benefit during a 30 months period treatment. So the design was based on hierarchical testing procedure. The primary objective was to demonstrate non-inferiority of extended phase anticoagulation using reduced dose drug versus full dose drug for the prevention of recurrent venous thromboembolism. Key secondary objectives, if the main objective was verified, was to demonstrate the superiority of a reduced dose over full dose drug on major or clinically relevant non-major bleedings and confirm on the composite of recurrent venous thromboembolism or major bleeding or clinically relevant non-major bleeding. Other secondary objectives were occult death and arterial cardiovascular events. Outcomes, so the primary outcome was adjudicated symptomatic recurrent venous thromboembolism based on ASTH and SSC recommendation. Key secondary outcomes were adjudicated major and clinically relevant non-major bleedings during follow-up and the composite of adjudicated recurrent VTE and bleeding. Of note, on the primary outcome, we choose, I would say, a strong primary outcome, which was defined by fatal pulmonary embolism, non-fatal pulmonary embolism, or isolated proximal deep vein thrombosis during follow-up. All outcomes were centrally validated by independent clinical events committee. The design was simple. It was an academic trial, multi-center, randomized open-blind endpoint trial. The randomization was stratified by center, type of DOAC, and antiplatelet use. 47 French centers were participating, and patients were included after 6 to 24 months of anticoagulation, and they were allocated to receive low dose apixaban or rivaroxaban, or full dose apixaban or rivaroxaban during a follow-up, a median follow-up of 24 months during the first stage. Some statistical points. There was no planned interim analysis, and again, there was a hierarchical testing procedure with an intention to treat analysis as the primary analysis. Non-inferiority primary hypothesis was based on a 2% recurrent VTE rate per year. It was close to the 1.7 I showed you, but given the high risk of recurrence, we increased at 2% expected risk of recurrence per year, with a 90% power to exclude the hazard ratio of 1.7. And the case superiority secondary hypothesis was a 35% reduction on bleeding. And so 2,200 patients with a median follow-up of 24 months were expected. But in 2021, we showed an overall rate of recurrent venous thromboembolism, which was much lower than expected at 1 year. And so we increased the sample size at 2,774 patients, and we increased the duration of follow-up at 30 months median follow-up. Here is a flow chart. So we had 1,383 patients in the reduced dose and almost the same in the full dose. The median follow-up was 36 months, which was ranged between 0 and 5 years, and only 2.5% of patients were lost to follow-up. And the primary analysis was done on intention to treat analysis. Here are the characteristics, and what was important to note, about 30% had BMI above 30. 1/3 has a family history of venous thromboembolism, but the most striking characteristic is that 85% of patients were included for pulmonary embolism with or without deep vein thrombosis, and 20% of them were included after PE at intermediate high or high risk of death. The second observation is that patients were included for after a first episode of unprovoked venous thromboembolism in 60%, and about 1/3 after a second or a third episode of unprovoked venous thromboembolism. Lastly, they were at high risk of recurrence, at a high risk of bleeding in about 30% of these patients, and there was almost the equal number of patients on apixaban or on rivaroxaban. The primary outcome, so the 5-year cumulative incidence was 1.8 in the full dose and 2.2 in the reduced dose. There was similar episodes of recurrent PE, fatal PE, and the difference was on the proximal deep vein thrombosis. The adjusted hazard ratio was 1.32, and the higher boundary of the confidence interval was above 1.7, and consequently, the non-inferiority p-value was not significant. It was 0.23. Of note, we had at 5 years 2% of event, which was much lower than expected, which means that we have about 1.5 annual incidence rates of recurrence over the 5 years of follow-up, with an absolute difference of 0.4%. Here is the curve that shows that the curves are were confounding and confirmed, and we can see the low rate of recurrence. Now, regarding secondary outcomes, clinically relevant bleeding were 50.2% in the full dose and 9.9% in the reduced dose. So there was a risk reduction of 39% of bleeding, and particularly there was a 60% risk reduction of major bleeding. There was also a reduction of 33% of the composite outcome of recurrent and clinically relevant bleeding. Here are the curves with the same graduation. So you can see that here the risk of bleeding is the concern in this study. And you can see the strong reduction rate of clinically relevant bleeding, and also the benefit in terms of composite outcome of recurrence and bleeding. Lastly, regarding other secondary outcomes, there was almost similar rates of death and arterial cardiovascular events in the two groups. And finally, the conclusion of this study, we can summarize with 3 points of view. First, this is a statistician point of view, and Émilie will develop that. Drug dose reduction in patients with VTE who need extended anticoagulation did not meet the study non-inferiority criteria. There is now a physician point of view. The 5-year cumulative rates of 2% of recurrent venous thromboembolism are low and reassuring in both groups. And there was a major benefit in terms of the reduction of clinically relevant bleeding and the net clinical benefit. And there is a third point is about the patients. It's likely that this finding will be useful to enrich shared decision-making process for patients with VTE who need extended anticoagulation. And this interpretation has been emphasized by Saskia Middeldorp on her editorial. And so again, 2% of event at 5 years is reassuring low, with a potential inferiority of the reduced dose, which lacks clinical relevance in the context of these low absolute risk. And we are so interested in the benefit in terms of safety and net clinical benefit. Lastly, just to show you, based on our previous estimates of a 2% rates of recurrence per year, we would expect a 10% recurrence at 5 years. And with hazard ratio, which should not be higher than 1.7, we were, I would say, ready to accept a maximal risk of 17% of recurrence at 5 years. That was the margin. Here, what we had, it is a 2% risk of recurrence at 5 years. And we had a higher bound of the confidence interval of 2.6, which means that the maximum that could occur in the study is cumulative rates of recurrent venous thromboembolism at 5 years of 5.7%, which remain lower than our primary hypothesis. Now, how to explain this low rate of recurrence? It looks like the patients had very strong adherence to treatment. Only 2% had non-compliance treatment. We had also a very few less to follow up. And lastly, before ending this first part, we didn't find a significant heterogeneity between the strata on the treatment effect, but there was a signal of a potential higher risk of recurrent venous thromboembolism in obese patients and potentially in patients with severe PE, that is high risk of death or intermediate high risk of death. In patients older, there is a strong benefit. And also, it was interesting to note that there was no difference on the treatment effect between apixaban and rivaroxaban. And here, I would like to thank all the network, but also in memory to Guy Meyer and Professor Lacutte. I will now give the talk to Émilie.
Do you see my slide?
Yes.
Okay. Now that you know all of RENOVE's results, let's take a closer look at its methodology. Before I get started, I just want to say sorry. My English isn't as good as I would like. So thank you for your patience. So RENOVE is a non-inferiority trial with a hierarchical three-step process. The first step is the non-inferiority test on the primary outcome, recurrence VTE. In the hierarchical procedure, we can only move on to the second step if the non-inferiority is confirmed, if the result on the primary outcome is statistically significant. If not, no further statistical testing is allowed. So, if the non-inferiority is confirmed, we can go to the second step to test the superiority of the low dose in RENOVE trials on the first case secondary outcome, major bleeding or clinically relevant non-major bleeding. As for the second step, we can move on to the third step if superiority on bleeding is confirmed. Only under this condition, we can test superiority on the composite endpoint. Unfortunately, as you can see, non-inferiority could not be demonstrated in RENOVE. The hazard ratio is 1.32 with an upper limit of confidence interval of 2.60. The non-inferiority margin was defined as 1.70. So clearly, 2.60 is way above that. As a result, no statistical test could be performed beyond that point, according to our hierarchical procedure. So, non-inferiority is not demonstrated, which means we couldn't test case secondary outcomes. But there are important outcomes, bleeding safety outcomes. Should we really stop here? I'm a statistician, and I say, yes, we should stop here. No p-value can be performed. To control the alpha risk, you have to stop testing if the primary outcome doesn't reach significance, even if, as in RENOVE, the results on case secondary outcome are tempting, with both hazard ratio 0.61 0.67 with an upper limit of confidence interval of 0.79 and 0.86. We can feel frustrated or disappointed, just like the characters in the animation film Inside Out. But you can't draw conclusions on the key secondary outcomes if the effect on the primary outcome is not demonstrated. That's the deal with the hierarchical procedure. It's the deal. But RENOVE is beautiful, extremely well-conducted study. So if non-inferiority is not demonstrated, someone must to blame. Right? It's not the statistician. Let's investigate who's guilty. In my opinion, it might be the non-inferiority margin. How was this important number chosen? First, we have to ask, what's the effect of reference treatment, here full dose anticoagulation, compared to placebo? Two studies help us here, amplify extension and resonate. You know them by heart. Both show a strong effect of apixaban or dabigatran compared to placebo, with hazard ratio of 0.20 and 0.08, and an upper limit of confidence interval of 0.34 and 0.25. These limits represent the smallest treatment effect. Once we know that, the next question is how much efficacy loss is acceptable in exchange for reduced bleeding. There's a formula to estimate the percentage of efficacy of reference treatment that we are going to retain. And so we can estimate, we can know the loss of efficacy consented. In RENOVE, with a non-inferiority margin equal to 1.70, we could lose up to 49% of the reference treatment's efficacy. But if we change the margin to completely at random, like 2.61, with the new margin, we could lose up to 89% of efficacy of reference treatment. But we could demonstrate non-inferiority. And we could test all case secondary outcomes. But is that clinically acceptable to lose 89% of reference treatment efficacy? Probably not. So in the end, 1.70 seems to be a good compromise. Non-inferiority margin, not guilty. Next aspect, the analysis population. In superiority trial, as you all know, the reference analysis population is the intention to treat. Why? Because we want to avoid demonstrating a difference that does not exist. So we include everyone, every patient, and not increase group difference, such as when patients with protocol deviation are removed. In non-inferiority trial, it's the opposite. Here, we want to avoid masking an existing difference. So we avoid here situation that could reduce the difference between groups. And we focus on the per protocol populations. There's a problem with per protocol analysis. It can introduce bias, like confounding and baseline difference between groups, so loss of group comparability. The recommendation is in non-inferiority trials, use both population, intention to treat, and per protocol. Only make conclusion if results are consistent across both. Now, let's check RENOVE. In the publication, the main results is based on the intention to treat population. We may have found a guilty party, but in the supplementary file, we find the per protocol analysis as planned in the methods. And it's confirmed that the same conclusion, non-inferiority, isn't demonstrated in either population, ITT, or per protocol. So, analysis population, not guilty too. But wait, event rates were much lower than expected, with an expected rate of 4%, but an observed rate in control group of 1.8%. That's suspicious. I've got a new suspect. The primary endpoint was very strict. Only perirecurrence or symptomatic proximal DVT. What if we include all DVTs, distal or other sites? We have the result on secondary endpoints. And indeed, incidence increased by 0.4% in full dose group and 1.2% in low dose group. But the hazard ratio confidence interval still go up to 2.97, far above 1 to 1.70. So still no non-inferiority. But this leads us to the next question. Is using a relative margin of non-inferiority rather than an absolute one the best choice given this low event rates? Let's go back to the initial hypothesis. With an expected rate of 4% and a relative non-inferiority margin of 1.7, we could up to 6.8% in the low dose group. That corresponds to a margin on the absolute difference risk of 2.8%. Now, here's the twist. With an absolute with an absolute margin and the actual RENOVE data, we could demonstrate the non-inferiority. The absolute difference is 0.40 with an upper limit of confidence interval of 1.85, much lower than the non-inferiority margin in absolute of 2.8. Well, that's the hedge. I have find the non-inferiority with this new margin. So should we have used an absolute margin instead? But hold on. The observed rate is much lower than the expected. The expected is 4%. I have 1.8% in the full dose group. With this new margin, this absolute non-inferiority margin of 2.8, we could accept up to 4.6% incidence in the low dose group. more than double the risk of recurrence of VTE. So yes, I assume I am a killjoy. But with an absolute margin, non-inferiority is mathematically demonstrated. But is that clinically acceptable? With this margin, we would lost 87% of the reference treatment efficacy. In the end, maybe not such a good idea. In conclusion, in RENOVE, because we use a hierarchical testing procedure and non-inferiority on primary outcome isn't demonstrated, we couldn't go further and test case secondary outcomes like bleeding. Of course, we would like to blame someone, to find guilty responsible for not demonstrating the non-inferiority. But choosing a non-inferiority margin of 1.70 in relative terms seems to be a right choice, preserving a minimum efficacy of the reference treatment and taking into account the lower than expected incidence with the relative terms. In the end, the conclusion is confirmed in both attention to treat population and per protocol population, and with all DVTs. So it's a good choice. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you found it interesting.
No, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. Francis is going to give us some additional clinical context as well.
Okay, do you see my slides?
They look, yes.
Okay, so what about consequences for clinical practice and clinical research? So we mainly worked on patients with unprovoked venous thromboembolism, and we know that the extending treatment is beneficial, and if we stop treatment after 1 or 2 years, there is a loss in the benefit, and we have two choices: short duration of indefinite duration of anticoagulation. And should we treat all patients indefinitely when they have unprovoked venous thromboembolism? In fact, the first question remains about should we extend or not? Because 40% of patients who will not have recurrence, it is good to extend treatment indefinitely. But in the 60% of patients who will not have recurrence if we stop treatment, here, if you continue treatment, you will expose patients to an increased risk of bleeding without a benefit. And so it remains very important to identify this patient. This is a key question for the clinician. And finally, today, we have two questions: patients who completed at least 6 months anticoagulation for a first unprovoked venous thromboembolism. Should we prolong or to stop treatment? And if we prolong, at what dose? And how to resolve this issue? And here I just present you a perspective of what we are doing with the European consortium. Because here, if we try to determine the risk of recurrence or bleeding in patients, we have some clinical, biological, and morphological data. Alone, the discriminant power is low, and more we combine informations and more we increase the discriminant power to predict risk in patients. And artificial intelligence can also increase probably the accuracy of the tools. But in fact, there is another point. First, predictive tools cannot be perfect. And even if they are very important and strong, there is also, it is very important to take in account the patient's risk perceptions, preference, and objective regarding the care and acceptability of treatment. And here, it is very important to work with anthropologists and psychologists to better understand what the patients want, what they prefer, what fear they have. And also, there is the importance of times. It is a conceptual presentation regarding the risk of thrombosis. There is some constant factor with the genetic component. Regarding AIDS, there is an exponential risk of venous thromboembolism, but also there is unconstant risk over the life according to additional disease, such as autoimmune disease. It is pretty the same with the hemorrhagic risk. There is some genetic component, there is the effect of age, and there are many circumstances where the risk of bleeding can be increased. And here we can see that this has impact on the duration, but also now on the dose of anticoagulation. So these two aspects are very important. And regarding patients, I'd like to show this work of Walter Agenot on the RENOVE registry. As you can see on the black curve, patients with unprovoked venous thromboembolism are still on anticoagulation at 1 year in 55% of cases, but there are only 19% of cases at 2 years. In some patients, it can be a physician's decision, but in some cases, it can be a patient's decision. And so it's very important because the patient's preferences will change over the time. And the concept here is to try to dispose of a very accurate predictive tool. This is the precision medicine component, but it is also important to have methods to discuss with the patients regarding perceptions, fears, and preferred outcomes. And also, all these components, these two aspects of the evaluation will change over the time. I would say a patient with the first unprovoked pulmonary embolism will likely to prefer to prolong treatment at 6 months. But at 1 year, some of patients ask us if we could stop or decrease the dose. So it's very important to develop a shared decision-making process in order to include both aspects of precision medicine and patient-centered medicine. And this is the purpose of the Morpheus project, which involved 8 countries in Europe and which is granted by the European Commission. The first objective is to develop a time-dependent multi-component intervention tool integrated in a shared decision-making process to optimize anticoagulation effectiveness. It is based on quantitative analysis and qualitative approaches. And now we are starting a step-to-age cluster randomized trial, the FR study, which aims to validate this tool in order to assess, to demonstrate the benefit for the patient to conduct anticoagulation, or at least management, based on a shared decision-making process. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you both for such fantastic presentations and showing us where the next steps in this understanding the best way to treat our patients is going. So we have a couple of questions from the audience that have been submitted, and please, if anybody else has other questions, put them into the Q&A. So the first one is, walk us through the decision to start with the hierarchical process instead of having a composite outcome of recurrent thrombosis and bleeding.
Émilie, I start. So we had very many discussions in our group regarding this aspect. And when we see the results, yes, we can say that maybe we should have taken the composite outcome. It was what I have done with the PADIS-P trial, comparing an additional 18 months of warfarin with the placebo. But the problem with the composite outcome is that the two components are not going in the same way. First, and we are not completely certain about the case fatality rates. In other words, about the weight of each items. So it is an aspect. And we even discussed about the fact to put the bleeding risk as the primary outcome before. But anyway, we could have made the choice of a benefit, a superiority on bleeding outcome as the primary, and if it was confirmed, to be able to show non-inferiority. And here we could have at least our primary outcome confirmed. So, and I think the presentation of Émilie was very nice about that. I think the statistician, you can ask to the statistician what he can do. No more. Otherwise, we can demonstrate everything. And almost she did what we shouldn't do. It is to perform lots of simulation here. And finally, we will be able to demonstrate it is demonstrated. And I can reveal to you if the difference is only due to 4 recurrent events regarding the non-inferiority on the primary. If the 4 events were in the full dose groups, in fact, we could have demonstrated non-inferiority. So here there is a bad luck probably aspect. All thoughts per protocol analysis also confirmed that there was maybe a difference, particularly on small recurrent clot, on deep vein thrombosis, for example, other locations, but it was mainly about proximal and deep vein thrombosis. No differences in P recurrence. So I think there is like a game here. Again, we think that the safety issue, it is difficult to put as a primary, because first, you have to certain that the loss in benefit is acceptable.
Yeah.
And the study here is interesting because we can't completely exclude, but the clinical interpretation, and it was beautifully written by Saskia Middeldorp. Here, just look at the curves, so we can see that our problem now is the bleeding risk, not really the risk of recurrence. And I would say 10% of clinically relevant bleeding at 5 years, it is not satisfying. It is too much. It remains too much. We have to do better. And so we have to work maybe with new molecules, for example. But again, even with anti-11 factors inhibitors, I think we still need to be sure that the loss in benefit is acceptable before showing the benefit in bleeding risk. But it is a challenging issue. When we see the results, we could have some regrets. But in fact, I think I prefer these results because even if a study is perfect, there is always something residual, which is uncertain. In fact, even if it is in appearance perfect. And here it makes sense that maybe in obese patients, maybe lowering the dose is not a good idea. And for clinicians, I would say my daily clinical practice in patients with a PE in shock, which was unprovoked, I'm not comfortable to propose low dose thereafter. At least we are some in France, among cardiologists particularly, they are not comfortable to decrease. So it makes sense that maybe there could be a difference.
To go off of what you just mentioned, the issue of obesity, and thankfully, or within your population, you had a third of patients that were above 30 kilos or kilograms per meter squared BMI. How many patients did you have at even higher weights than that? And was there insufficient, for example, patients above 40 to take a look at that subpopulation?
Yes, it's a very important question. So we will present the results on the ISTH Congress. We have 4 abstracts accepted, and regarding obese patients and high-risk PE, which will be presented as oral communication. So we will provide additional information. I completely agree with you. I'm not afraid about 30 or 35 BMI, but clearly about 40 is an important issue that we will explore with Émilie.
Fantastic. That will help. I saw a patient yesterday that this question came up with, so I'll tell her we know more. We will know more in June. Fantastic. One other a question a bit on statistics that was submitted ahead of time. So defining the p-value to determine non-inferiority. So the question was, you know, we live and die by the p-value of 0.05. So the question was, is that the right p-value, or is there any time where that p-value is different or higher than 0.05? Or is 0.05 always what we use to define determine non-inferiority?
In fact, because why we use hierarchical design, it is to avoid p-value consummation. So in fact, so if we make sequential analysis, we have to decrease the p-value according to the number of tests. But when we do a hierarchical design, it is done to keep the 5% cutoff on the p-value. Are you agree, Émilie? Because I'm not statistician, so I wouldn't.
Yes, I confirm that. The hierarchical procedure, with the hierarchical procedure, we can conclude at 5% at each step. But if you don't conclude exit, you don't make a performed over test.
Thank you so much. One other last question that was submitted about kind of additional subgroup analysis. One is about the patients with cancer. So maybe I'm teeing up another one of your abstracts, but looking at questions about sort of the definition of cancer that was used for this study, given the other trials in cancer patients alone, versus and then if there has been any additional analysis on that subgroup.
In fact, in our study, so patient couldn't be included with an active cancer at the a cancer which was active at the time of venous thromboembolism. And before inclusion, we should have at least 20 years without evolution of the cancer. So what we had, in fact, in the study is mainly patients with hormonal therapy for breast cancer or prostate cancer, or in apparent resolved cancer. So we didn't have evolutive cancers. That was mainly our patients. And as you know, there is now a beautiful study on cancer patients regarding the optimal dose with the APICAT study of Isabelle Mahé on behalf of the INVENT-VTE network and also international networks, which confirm also that the low dose is very effective and safe.
Fantastic. All right, well, I will give you a last opportunity to any last parting words for our viewers today.
Émilie, do you want to start?
No, you start always.
Okay.
It's your study.
I would say maybe I will just tell us what we feel on the steering committee when we saw the results and how it happens, because the clinicians see the results. I would say a little bit small deception regarding non-inferiority, but we were, wow, there is no recurrences. There is no recurrency. But the benefit of the bleeding risk is so high that as a clinician, I can't continue to put patients on full dose of drug therapy. And there were Émilie Presles and Sylvie Laporte. And thanks to her, as a statistician, that they say, hey, guys, stop. It is not like that, not completely like that. And there was, I would say, a strong but nice conversation and discussion, controversy between us on how to present the results. And I would say it was also the same with the exchanges with journals during the reviewing process, because we can see the two options. And it is why I presented to you, I would say, 3 views. The statistician is very important because it means that we can't exclude, even small, a loss in benefit. And it is good in medicine to have this aspect, because we too many times we say it is strongly demonstrated. We should do that in every patient. But it's important to have some nuances. There is now the clinician point of view with some experience and the feeling with the patient. So there is a room to adapt the things. But the first part now, and we have to work on that, is how to present to the patients, how they will see the results. And we can say that probably there is at least 2 types of patients. You have patients that were so stressed by pulmonary embolism that they do not want to have any risk of recurrence, and they are ready to choose the full dose, even if there is a high risk of bleeding. If the treatment, there is nothing at 2 years, they will tell you, but I don't have any bleeding. I prefer to keep the full dose. I don't not have a new recurrence. It was too much hard. And you have a second profile where a patient understands that it is a secondary prevention. The rates of recurrence are so low, with a difference between the group of 0.5%. And for many patients, what is important when they take treatment over the time, on long term, is to avoid side effects. And they will be happy to decrease the risk of bleeding, because they will see what it is 5% and 10% on the risk, and they will choose the low dose. So here there is a room for discussing with the patients. I think it will, for me, it will improve the quality of the consultation of the patient, and finally, regarding a constructive discussion. And it is why it's so important today to be able to work on the patient's perception and preference, and how to detect what could be, because the questions are very important, and we have to find the way to discuss and to evaluate what is really what the patients really want. And we have also to make effort on the presentations of results. So for me, it's exciting for the clinical practice, in fact.
Absolutely. And so I thank you both for such a educational and important discussion of your trial today, and congratulations on completing such an important work. And thank you, obviously, to the audience for joining us today. Please stay tuned for our details about our June and September seminars. And just one last other announcement as a reminder, we do have a Dragon's Den competition that will be occurring at ISTH in June. The deadline is coming up very soon, April 16th. And we have multiple past winners that have gone on to very important trial results as well. We will also be hosting an in-person meet and greet at ISTH. So please join our mailing list to stay connected to that, and we hope to see you all there. Thank you.